After years of city life, I finally traded the constant noise, traffic, and suffocating rules for the wide-open skies and quiet solitude of the countryside. Owning a few acres and a barn had been a dream, a place where I could escape deadlines, nosy neighbors, and the chaos of urban living. I imagined mornings spent sipping coffee on the porch, afternoons tinkering in my barn, and nights under a blanket of stars. For the first few weeks it was perfect. Birds sang, the wind whispered through the trees, and I could finally breathe. But the peace I'd hoped for came with an unexpected complication. An HOA. I had assumed that HOAs were only for cookie-cutter suburbs, not for sprawling countryside properties, but apparently Karen, the HOA president, didn't see it that way. Her first contact was a polite letter about the color of my barn, which she insisted was unapproved. I laughed. The barn had stood for decades, long before I owned the property, but Karen was insistent. Then came the second letter, more demanding, this time threatening fines if I didn't comply with some obscure community guidelines I'd never agreed to. I brushed it off at first, thinking she'd get bored. But Karen didn't get bored. She got obsessive. Suddenly, my dream of a quiet life was punctuated by her emails, her phone calls, and eventually, her appearance on my property with a clipboard in hand. Her smug, self-satisfied smile suggested she believed she had the authority to run my life. It was unnerving, and I realized quickly that Karen didn't just care about rules. She cared about power. What I thought would be a sanctuary in the countryside was turning into a battlefield. The longer I ignored her, the more aggressive she became, and I had the sinking feeling that this wasn't going to end with polite letters. Karen had picked her target, and it was me. Little did she know I was ready to fight back, and I was about to learn just how far she was willing to go. The first real confrontation came on an ordinary afternoon. I had just finished repairing the barn door when a thick envelope appeared on my doorstep. Inside was a fine $500 for an unauthorized agricultural structure. My barn, which had stood for decades before I purchased the property, was suddenly deemed illegal. I shook my head in disbelief. I had expected HOA letters about colors or landscaping, but a fine for the barn itself felt absurd. I decided to confront Karen directly, thinking that perhaps face-to-face she would see reason. When she arrived, she was accompanied by two men who introduced themselves as HOA inspectors. Their expressions were serious, as though they were performing a mission of national importance. Karen waved her clipboard at me, citing regulations I had never agreed to. She claimed my barn violated the community code and demanded immediate access to inspect its contents. I told her politely but firmly that she had no right to enter my property. She smiled, a smug, calculating smile that sent a chill down my spine, and left, promising to escalate the matter. That was the moment I realized this was more than just a petty dispute over property rules. Karen wasn't just enforcing guidelines. She was obsessed with control. Her letters became more frequent, filled with threats of fines, legal action, and even claims that my barn might be used for illegal activities. I laughed at the absurdity, but there was an edge of tension in my voice when I told her to leave. From that day forward, it was clear that Karen had declared war, and I was her target. Every interaction, every letter, every phone call carried the weight of someone determined to dominate, intimidate, and humiliate me. I knew then that ignoring her would only make things worse. I had to be careful, but I also knew I wasn't going to let her win. Karen had underestimated me, and soon she would learn that I could fight back in ways she never imagined. It didn't take long before I realized that Karen's obsession with control had taken a new, unsettling turn. At first, it was subtle. An unfamiliar car parked near my fence, engine off, headlights dark, just sitting there for hours. I'd watch it from my porch, pretending not to notice, but my instincts told me it wasn't just a coincidence. Soon, I noticed small drones hovering over my property at odd hours, their blinking lights cutting through the night sky like tiny spies. Security cameras I had installed for peace of mind began capturing more than just the occasional deer or raccoon. Faces, figures, and shadows of people moving near the barn at strange hours were recorded, often vanishing before I could confront them. I decided to take a closer look and review the footage. What I saw made my stomach tighten. HOA patrols were walking around the barn, snapping pictures, and jotting notes in small, meticulous notebooks. They claimed it was routine inspection, but this was clearly surveillance, trespassing disguised as official duty. Every time I mentioned it to neighbors, they either shrugged or whispered that Karen was just protecting the community. The problem was, this wasn't about community safety, it was personal. She wanted control and she wanted proof that she could wield it. I didn't panic, but I did get organized. I called the county office to double-check my permits and zoning status. Every building on my property, including the barn, was perfectly legal. Nothing Karen had claimed held up on paper. Still, she didn't stop. Her messages became increasingly aggressive, filled with veiled threats about fines, lawsuits, and escalating violations. I started noticing patterns, how she timed her patrols when her drones appeared, which neighbors she tried to recruit as spies. It became clear that Karen's obsession had crossed from petty annoyance into full-blown harassment. By the end of that week, I knew I couldn't handle this passively. Karen's spying wasn't just irritating, it was dangerous. I needed a plan, and I needed it to be airtight. If she wanted a battle, I would meet her on my terms. And this time, I would have allies who could ensure that Karen's obsession with power didn't go unchecked. Karen didn't waste any time escalating her attacks. Within days of her latest surveillance, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA, claiming that my barn contained hazardous materials and posed a threat to the entire community. I couldn't help but laugh. My barn was filled with nothing more dangerous than hay, tools, and a few old barrels of paint. But Karen didn't see it that way. In her mind, suspicion was proof, and she seemed determined to turn every harmless aspect of my property into a criminal violation. A county inspector arrived shortly afterward to investigate her claims. He was professional, courteous, and most importantly, unimpressed by Karen's theatrics. As he walked through my barn, examined the tools, and checked the storage barrels, he chuckled and reassured me that everything was in perfect order. There were no violations, no hazardous materials, nothing illegal. The inspector left, shaking his head at the ridiculousness of Karen's accusation. I thought maybe this would finally teach her a lesson, but Karen's pride wouldn't allow her to admit defeat. Instead, she went on the offensive. The next day, I received another letter through the HOA newsletter, calling me uncooperative and a threat to community standards. The tone was increasingly aggressive, and she started whispering rumors to neighbors, painting me as a rule breaker and troublemaker. I began to notice subtle changes in how people looked at me. Some avoided my property entirely, while others cast nervous glances, uncertain what to believe. It was clear Karen wasn't just targeting me. She was trying to isolate me, manipulate the community, and turn everyone against me. That's when I realized that ignoring her wasn't an option. Karen's obsession had gone beyond petty regulations or annoying letters. She was playing a game of control, and she wanted to win at any cost. I needed a strategy, something beyond passive resistance. I started documenting every interaction, recording every letter, and keeping logs of every suspicious activity. If Karen wanted a war, she had picked the wrong opponent. I wasn't about to be intimidated, and I was ready to fight back, and in a way that she would never see coming. By the time Karen's harassment reached its peak, I knew I couldn't rely on anger or threats alone. I needed someone with authority, someone who could enforce the law and ensure that Karen's antics didn't cross legal boundaries. That's when I reached out to a friend at the county sheriff's office. I explained the situation, her constant surveillance, her baseless complaints, and her attempts to intimidate me and manipulate neighbors. He listened carefully, asked detailed questions, and gave me advice I would soon realize was priceless. HOAs have no legal right to enter private barns or farmland without your permission, he said firmly. If she tries again, call us first. Document everything and don't confront her alone. His words felt empowering. For the first time, I knew that Karen's obsession with control had limits, legal limits that she didn't understand. More importantly, I realized I had allies who could protect me while I played the game on my own terms. We discussed potential strategies. My friend suggested setting up controlled situations where any attempt at trespassing could be legally caught on camera and immediately addressed by law enforcement. I took notes, visualized scenarios, and began planning carefully. Karen's pattern was predictable. She thrived on creating opportunities to claim violations, always escalating the situation to assert dominance. Knowing this, I could anticipate her moves, and the sheriff's advice gave me the edge I needed. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of confidence and control. Karen's harassment had been escalating unchecked, But now I had a clear plan: observe, document, and respond legally. I began reinforcing my barn, installing extra cameras, and arranging a way to communicate instantly with the sheriff if she made another move. I also started mapping her patterns, the time she sent patrols, the routes they took, and her preferred tactics. It was a turning point. Karen believed she held all the power, but in reality I had the advantage. I wasn't just protecting my property anymore. I was preparing for a confrontation that would finally put her in her place. And when the time came, I knew the sheriff would be there, quietly, strategically, and waiting for her to make the first mistake. I realized that if I wanted to finally end Karen's relentless harassment, I needed to set a trap she couldn't resist. She thrived on trying to catch me breaking the rules, so I decided to give her the perfect bait. That night, I left the barn lights on, moving some old equipment into obvious, exposed positions. It wasn't illegal, of course, but it looked like something worth inspecting. I knew her ego wouldn't allow her to resist. She had to prove in her mind that I was violating the rules, and I was more than happy to let her play her part. Before darkness fell, I called my friend at the sheriff's office. "Tonight's the night," I said, keeping my voice calm, but inside my heart raced with anticipation. He promised deputies would be discreetly stationed, waiting inside the barn for any unauthorized entry. I double-checked my security cameras, making sure every angle of the barn and driveway was covered. Everything was set. As the night deepened, I watched from the porch as Karen's familiar HOA truck slowly rolled up the driveway. My security feed showed her stepping out, flashlight in hand, accompanied by 2 members of her patrol. Their posture was confident, almost smug, like hunters approaching prey. I could almost hear her whispering about catching me red-handed. As they approached the barn, tools in hand, ready to assert authority where none existed. I stayed calm, watching the footage and listening for any movement, knowing that every second counted. This was no longer a game of intimidation. It was a test of patience and strategy. Karen's obsession had made her predictable, and I intended to use that to my advantage. As the figures neared the barn door, I felt a surge of satisfaction. The trap was set, and every piece of the plan was falling into place. Karen had no idea that the night she thought she would assert power over me would instead mark the beginning of her undoing. The sheriff was waiting, hidden in the shadows, ready to step in the moment Karen made her move. At precisely 2 a.m., the night air was still and heavy, broken only by the faint rustle of leaves and the occasional distant hoot of an owl. From my porch, I watched through the security cameras as Karen's headlights cut through the darkness. Her HOA truck rolled slowly up the driveway, the engine low and menacing. She stepped out, flashlight in hand, flanked by her 2 loyal patrol members, each carrying small crowbars and looking far too confident for my liking. They approached the barn like invaders, their shadows stretching long across the ground. Inside, I could feel the tension coiling like a spring. The sheriff's deputies were already in place, hidden behind the haystacks and storage racks. They were silent, motionless, and waiting patiently for the exact moment Karen's obsession with catching me would lead her into their trap. Every step she took outside was mirrored on my monitor, every whispered instruction to her patrol recorded. She had no idea that this seemingly simple break-in was about to become the undoing of her carefully constructed power fantasy. Karen fiddled with the padlock on the barn door, her hands trembling slightly in the cold night air. With a grunt, she pried it open, mumbling to her patrol about finally seeing what he's hiding. The deputies waited, hearts steady, biding their time. As soon as Karen's flashlight beam swept across the first haystack, a deep, authoritative voice cut through the night. "Sheriff's Department, freeze!" Screams erupted. Karen stumbled backward, dropping her crowbar, her patrol members frozen in shock. Deputies stepped forward, badges gleaming in the barn's dim light. Karen tried to cover her panic with lies, insisting they were just inspecting a violation, but the sheriff's sharp laugh cut her off. Cameras in the barn and outside recorded everything. Every dropped tool, every panicked gasp, every second of her humiliation. For the first time, Karen realized she had underestimated me. Her obsession with power had led her straight into a legal trap, and there was no escaping the consequences. The night she thought she would dominate was the night she lost everything. The moment Karen's flashlight illuminated the haystack, the barn erupted with authority. "Sheriff's Department, freeze!" boomed a voice that silenced every whisper and stomp. Karen and her patrol froze mid-step, crowbars clattering to the wooden floor. The deputies emerged from the shadows, badges reflecting the pale barn lights, their presence commanding and unmistakable. Karen's face went from smug confidence to pure terror in seconds, the reality of the situation crashing down around her. She tried to recover, stammering excuses about code violations and community inspections, but her words fell flat against the ironclad authority of the deputies. Every move she had made, every threat she had issued, was now recorded on security cameras, leaving no room for her to manipulate the truth. The deputies moved methodically, ensuring no one could claim confusion or mistake. Her patrol members, once so confident, now cowered, realizing the severity of trespassing onto private property with intent to intimidate. Karen's eyes darted around, desperate for a way out, but there was none. The sheriff stepped closer, calm yet firm. On private property at this hour with tools in hand? You're lucky we caught you before someone got hurt. Her lips trembled, but no lies could save her. Every second was documented, every violation logged, and there was nothing she could do to escape the consequences. Meanwhile, I watched from the porch, a mixture of relief and satisfaction washing over me. Karen's plan had backfired spectacularly. Her obsession with control and intimidation had made her predictable, and that predictability had been her undoing. The barn, which she had once viewed as a target for harassment, had become the stage for her public defeat. By the time the deputies escorted her and her patrol out, the night had changed forever. Karen's reputation was in tatters, the HOA's credibility shredded, and I felt an overwhelming sense of triumph. What had started as fear and intimidation had ended in justice, delivered quietly but decisively, inside the very barn she thought she could dominate. The morning after the barn incident, news spread through the community like wildfire. Karen's failed break-in and the sheriff's intervention became the talk of the town. Neighbors who had once whispered about my rule-breaking behavior now approached me with apologies, curiosity, and a mix of awe and relief. The video footage of Karen and her patrol stumbling under the sheriff's authoritative presence circulated quickly, leaving no doubt about who had been in the wrong. The HOA, once a looming force of intimidation, was suddenly under scrutiny, its credibility shattered. Karen herself faced immediate consequences. She was cited for trespassing and property damage, and the county launched an investigation into the HOA's practices. Her patrol members, who had blindly followed her orders, were also reprimanded, and the shame of their actions hung heavily over them. Many members of the community, previously loyal to Karen's strict enforcement of rules, began questioning her motives and the legitimacy of the HOA's authority. What had once seemed like a powerful organization was now exposed as petty, vindictive, and legally reckless. I posted clips of the surveillance footage online, not maliciously but as a way to document the truth. People watched, shared, and commented, and the response was overwhelmingly supportive. The narrative Karen had tried to control was reversed. She was no longer the enforcer of order but the subject of ridicule and legal consequence. The HOA's board resigned in droves, realizing that their association with Karen could no longer protect them. For me, the fallout was both satisfying and freeing. No more letters, no more threats, no more harassment. The barn, which had been a source of stress and fear, was now a symbol of resilience and strategy. Karen's obsession with control had led her to disaster, and the community finally saw her for who she truly was. I had protected my property, my rights, and my peace, and in doing so, I had turned a nightmare into a victory that would be remembered long after the embers of that night had cooled. Months passed, and the aftermath of Karen's failed attempt to intimidate me settled into a long-awaited sense of peace. The HOA, stripped of its power and credibility, was officially dissolved. The board members had either resigned or quietly faded from the community, unwilling to defend a system that had been exposed for its vindictive overreach. Karen, humiliated and legally accountable, had retreated from public life. Her influence, once looming over every property line and mailbox, had vanished like smoke. For the first time since moving to the countryside, I could breathe freely without fear of arbitrary fines or surprise inspections. I walked through my property, taking in the barn, the fields, and the wide-open skies. The barn had become more than a building. It was a monument to persistence and planning, A testament to the fact that careful strategy and legal support could outmatch arrogance and obsession. I repainted it a bright, unapologetic red. A subtle yet satisfying statement to anyone who might remember Karen's complaints about unapproved colors. It was mine, my sanctuary, my domain, my victory. The mornings became a ritual of tranquility. Coffee in hand, I would sit on the porch watching the sunrise over my fields. Birds chirped freely, the wind rustled the trees, and the distant mountains glowed in the soft light. There were no threats, no patrols, no whispers of rule violations. The land was mine to enjoy, and for the first time in years I truly felt at home. Occasionally I would think back to that night in the barn, the adrenaline, the tension, and the ultimate triumph. Karen's obsession with control had led her straight into a trap she had never anticipated, and justice had been delivered quietly but decisively. Every crowbar she had lifted, every step she had taken toward my barn, had been a step toward her own undoing. I smiled, knowing that peace, patience, and a little strategic planning had restored not just my property, but my life. The countryside was finally mine, and I had earned every serene, victorious moment.